Okay. So I thought we would read this reading in the discipline first.
Okay.
We'll take about 5 to 10 minutes to do that, and then we can talk about it. And Shauna, you can move over here until Myra comes if you want. Reading that article.
That's the. Wait, oh.
Yeah.
I couldn't find the other one.
The
Is
other
this the
one?
same one?
This is the Carnegie one.
Okay, this is the copy. Sorry, we're having this. Headache. I'm excited.
Was it attention hit it? You know we get it.
Oh, no, this one is up here.
Oh.
Hillary always
Whoa,
has
whoa,
this.
whoa, somebody got a haircut.
I did. I put my hair in there. It's for sure.
Nadia,
Thanks.
this is the love of my life. Do
I
one
won't
or
tell
two.
Ron. Just one. Thank you.
Probably have headaches and thinking of that stuff. All you do is ask and touch me.
6.
Okay, so I say we do popcorn reading to make this a little bit faster, and also so everyone's on the same page.
How many pages are there?
I think 13.
What?
So, are you guys on the reading and history part of section 6 yet?
Yeah, I just started that.
Okay. Everyone else agree?
I was trying to read this, but it took me a while.
Yeah, you can't read that. You
I can't, but it took a while.
I can't read that.
This is where I stopped, but I can always go back and
I'll just
read
skip that.
this.
Yeah, let's go to reading
Okay.
history.
So, Shauna, why don't you start that section, and then once we get to the next page, Myra go, and we'll keep with that pattern along the way.
Okie dokie.
The ability to read historical documents, including contemporary expectations about social, what is it?
Society?
There you go. Economic and political issues provides perhaps the most direct link to literacy as a preparation for citizenship, which
Presupposes.
an ability to conduct information debate. As in the other disciplines, schools are unique sites for youth across class to and ethnic boundaries to learn to read such documents, and equally important to develop the necessary dispositions to continue to engage in such reading for college and career success. While we focus explicitly on reading and history, the point more broadly applies to reading across the social sciences. Studies of how people reason about political issues offer interesting and potentially disturbing findings. Weinberg examined how people of particular age cohorts, including adolescents, reasoned about events from the Vietnam War. Interestingly, he discovered that the primary sources of information used to construct representations of events and issues in the war were movies. Adults who actually lived through the war used representations in film as their source of data, even when their own experiences contradicted the images in the films. While the ability to deconstruct fictional narratives from the films is an important and powerful skill set, film may not be the most reliable source of information for understanding historical events. Historians view primary source documents about events of the past as partially representing particular points of view and positioning as a rhetorical constructions. Primarily sourced documents in history may include political documents, legal documents, newspaper articles, letters, diaries, first and second-hand documents of events such as minutes, published proceedings, etc., and other kinds of archival data, including artistic representations, paintings and drawings, film, digital images, photographs, cartoons, etc.
Okay. Now let Myra go, because I don't think there's a break between them.
Viewing primary source documents as rhetorical constructions, historians seek to understand the internal stages and goals of agents who acted in the historical events. In examining primary source documents, historians ask themselves about the kind of document it is and how the document came into being. They examine word choice and what information is included and excluded. They seek corroboration across multiple sources. They assume such texts have subtexts that reflect the author's point of view, access to the experiences about which they write, and how the text is organized to appeal to what audience. In contrast, schools typically socialize students into seeing history as a simple chronology of events and the explanations of social, political, and economic phenomena offered in text as a truthful and unexamined master narrative. To illustrate some of the challenges of reading primary source documents in history, the following is an excerpt from Lincoln's speech, A House Divided. This is the kind of document a 12th grader in the U.S. schools should be familiar with and able to understand. The document is important, perhaps even more so than, for example, the often cited Gettysburg Address by Lincoln, because it poses political and ethical dilemmas with which we continue to wrestle today. We can easily identify current political species speeches made by political candidates in the Congress of the U.S. and by senior members of our government's administration that focus on similar issues as they manifest themselves today, and that employ similar rhetorical techniques to persuade audiences. The following are examples of discipline-based questions that a good reader might pose while reading a House Divided. What kind of speech is this? What self-interest might one expect from this kind of speech? Who is the audience? How is the text crafted to address this audience? What words and phrases used by Lincoln would have had a different meaning, connotation in 1858? What knowledge is presumed that a reader of that era would already know, particularly a member of the audience for whom the speech was drafted? Are there any contradictions or tensions between knowledge Lincoln pursues and knowledge from other historical documents about similar topics or events? What can we infer about Lincoln's motives and biases? What inferences does he make about the motives and biases of others, such as Stephen Douglas? How might the reader evaluate Lincoln's critique of Douglas and others in light of the reader's prior knowledge and the availability of the historical sources? What is the overall text structure of the document? What are the notices within the text that signal its structure?
Despite reform efforts advocated by the National Council for the Social Studies and pedagogical interventions, such as the document-based history project, the default experiences of most students is to learn history through the readings of history textbooks. While learning how to read, including how to critique, textbooks' representations of historical, political, and economic events and issues is important for success in high school. Research has documented that textbooks may actually be difficult to understand. Typically, we think textbooks as being easier to comprehend than primary source documents. This may be true at one level if one uses readability formulas as the measure of difficulty. However, as Beck and McCone have shown, is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Okay. In the attempt to create short text with simple sentences, textbook writers often inadvertently make it more difficult for students to understand concepts. Often, these texts will not use relational words between clauses, sentences, and paragraphs that would make explicit the logical response among ideas. I don't know what the word is. Novice readers do not have sufficient background knowledge to construct the unstated relationships, then must infer such relationships. In addition, these texts may also not provide sufficient detail for students to build understanding of concepts. Beck and colleagues tested the propositions by revising sections of 5th grade social studies textbooks. In box 4, we can include an example of one of these rewrites of a passage on the Boston Tea Party.
Okay. Can you pause real quick?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, I'm not in the classroom, so I'm not exactly sure. But do your students read textbooks in your classroom?
Really, no.
Okay.
They
I
put
know
me on
I did
textbooks.
in tech.
That's what I
I know I did a little bit when I was back in the days.
I know Beck, we sometimes use them to answer questions. Like if we had questions, the teachers would go to this chapter and answer the questions at the end of the chapter.
And did you guys find that helpful when you did that? Was it confusing at all?
No, because you don't know, I wouldn't, when they would ask me to do that, I don't know if I'm right. It sounds
Yeah.
right, but am I right? I always thought that way.
It was just like a copy paste.
Yeah.
I would just go to the question, find the answer, and then write whatever that sentence was.
And
That's what I
I've
did in history.
noticed, and I've noticed in the classroom too, when the teacher would try to be like, "Oh, use your book," they still wouldn't know, and she'd tell them exactly where to go and what pages and stuff, and they'd be super lost.
The kids though, I haven't seen them pull out a textbook once.
This was in Canyon that I saw them use the
Oh, really?
textbook. Yeah,
Yeah,
Miss
Canyon.
Bauman.
Oh, but I feel like she used it as a resource.
So Are you
Yeah, it was
asking
a
about
resource, not
when we studied, we use textbooks or in the actual
In the
school
actual classroom right now.
So you're asking about their courses.
Well, I'm kind of
No,
what
what I
Myra's
wanted to
doing
see.
right now. It's just telling me how it's being
At the
incorporated
school.
in the classroom.
No, like Canyon Middle School for math, they didn't even have a textbook. Not at all.
Yeah.
Like back when I was in school, we had a textbook and we did almost every other problem in the textbook.
Mhm.
And then when I was observing a science class, the 6th graders pulled out a textbook just to reference back and look for information that they needed.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my 8th grade class, they didn't use it at all.
And all the science and math classes have done no textbook.
No textbook. Yeah, I just think that's interesting, especially with the research now that says it's obviously very confusing. We want to try to at least avoid that sort of thing.
I don't know. I think you should have some context, like
Yeah.
reading, because they have to practice it from young. You just sort of expect them to hit high school and be able to do it.
Oh yeah, I'm
You
not
can get them
saying
newspapers
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
articles and journals.
Science journal.
I'm not
If
saying
you-
completely get rid of the textbook. I'm
No.
saying you need to train them how to do
Yeah,
it.
that's what I agree with that. But I'm just saying, because you suddenly just pop articles without doing it in the earlier grades, so suddenly the leap from having textbooks to boop, a real scientific article.
Yeah, you
It's
gotta.
it's a great leap. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, you gotta really lean in that.
Yeah, so if you want to do that, then you have to find some easy reading with the material that they need to read, but written for them at their level, which may be hard with scientific articles. You can't do that at lower levels.
Yeah, it's real hard.
Excuse me.
Excuse me. Okay. Hillary, do you remember
We're
where you
being
are?
recorded, yes, the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah. Okay.
According to Beckman College,
Sorry. Shoot first.
most of the revisions for this passage thus involved explaining and providing motivations for actions and reactions, and explicitly connecting causes to events and events to consequences. They found that the students had better rehold information in the rewrite passage. Beck's studies of the reading difficulty presented by the traditional textbooks are based on extensive research about how readers go about making sense of text. As is evident in these studies, research on the text processing indicates any of the following common patterns found in social studies and science textbooks can make comprehension challenging. Failure to make logical, i.e. casual, connections between propositions explicit. Use of references that are ambiguous, distant, or indirect. The inclusion of information that is relevant to the main ideas. Density of ideas within individual sentences. The features enumerated above tend to characterize what are sometimes called inconsiderate texts. Textbooks are not only sources of inconsiderate text. Primary source documents can also be inconsiderate. The example from the opening of the Declaration of Independence in box 5 illustrates 3 of the 4 patterns.
Go ahead, Mia.
Simple reference words like it, which, and them are syntactically difficult to decipher in this public document that all citizens should ideally be able to comprehend. The entire opening paragraph is a single sentence, and thus the density of propositions in this one sentence makes it difficult to unpack. The causal links between the decision to dissolve the political bands and to declare the causes which impel them to the separation are embedded in forbiddingly complex syntactical forms. More and less competent adolescents, readers will continue to struggle with both textbooks as well as primary source documents until explicit attention to text features, prior knowledge, vocabulary, comprehension monitoring, and processes become routine practices in classroom where students are expected to read in order to learn. These potential sources of reading difficulty and many more can be detected ahead of time by a content area teacher who is also well versed in what a reader needs to know to understand content area texts, including primary source documents. In fact, we would argue that history teachers are much better positioned to analyze these sources of difficulty we have described in these primary source documents than those typically teaching generic remedial reading courses in high school. History teachers are also more likely to understand the ways in which helping students to pay attention to and make sense of these kinds of text difficulties are intimately linked to history reasoning and content. The sources of difficulty we have described are not unique to these particular documents, but are recurrent, certainly in primary source documents in history and in the social studies. While our focus has been primarily on reading in high school, we have evidence of effective use of primary source documents in elementary history classes. Our point is that strategies for tackling these recurrent problems of reading can be taught, and that teaching them in the content of discipline-specific explorations involving the analysis of multiple documents of the sort we have included can simultaneously enhance the reading of content. Learning to read in discipline-specific ways does not need to interfere with learning content. Quite the reverse. We are not making a case against the growing use of general remedial reading courses in high school. We believe such courses are very important, and we have growing evidence of their impact. We are simply trying to illustrate here that it is possible to integrate reading instruction in content area courses that accomplish two important ends. One, meet the needs of students with an array of reading abilities simultaneously, and two, teach all students to reason in the complex ways that disciplines require. Reading literature. As with reading in history, it is probably most easy to make the case for reading in literature classrooms. However, there have been attacks and debates regarding the function of the literature curriculum. In this section, we make a case for why learning to read literature is important. We also highlight some of the problems inherent in how literature is typically taught in our high schools, and how these problems contribute to the difficulties that struggling readers face. By demonstrating what is entailed in interpreting literature, we try to illustrate what readers, struggling and competent, need to know in order to become good and hopefully lifelong readers of rich literature. Just as there are limitations to the range of genres that students learn to read in other content area courses, there are also limitations in the range of text to which students are exposed in literature classes, particularly in schools in low-income communities, serving students of color, and in basic skills-oriented classes in departments that are tracked. The range of text in such low-track classes is quite different from, for example, advanced placement courses. It remains the case that the dominant source of reading in the high school English class is the commercial literature anthology. Just as there is little direct instruction about how to tackle the problems that disciplinary texts pose in history, science, and mathematics classrooms, there is also insufficient attention in literature classrooms to the nuts and bolts of how to read a range of literary texts. It remains the case that literature teachers are more likely to ask students about the symbolism in literary texts than to model or teach how to detect the symbolic from the literal, and how to reconstruct the figurative inferences to be made about symbols in literature.
Yeah. So, there was a little bit about, is there upper level and lower level classes in middle schools now?
There's like pre-AP.
There's pre-AP
Okay.
and regular.
Have you guys seen
That's
those
only
differences
Yes.
in classes?
In 8th grade.
No.
7th grade has.
7th grade has pre-AP.
Really?
Oh yeah. I saw an 8th grade pre-AP class.
Yeah, my CT is pre-AP.
I haven't seen any pre-AP stuff.
You haven't seen any pre-AP? I was just wondering, because I guess if I was in the classroom, I would understand how reading would be different between the upper level and the lower level classes.
I don't know. It's different.
I haven't seen that. to
I
be
haven't
honest.
seen it, just the fact that they didn't use textbooks
Yeah.
or anything,
Mhm.
so I don't know. They
Yeah.
pretty much did all the exact same worksheets,
Oh, okay.
but
Yeah.
the pre-AP finished faster. That's what I saw.
pretty much.
I don't know. Maybe that's more of
They
a
don't
like,
do a lot of reading, from what I know.
Did you start your block next semester?
spring semester. Yeah. Okay, so I will read now. Okay. Only a small percentage of students graduating high school remain long life readers of the kinds of canonical texts that the literature curriculum hopes to apprentice them into appreciating. Understanding the rhetorical tools that the authors employ in narratives, fictional, autobiographical, or biographical, is necessary to understand a range of warrantable interpretations of complex literary works. We say warrantable interpretations because literature invites multiple points of view. What is specific to this discipline is the nature of what counts as evidence and what kinds of questions are valued. Evaluations of such work also requires an ideal sense that readers understand how the author goes about shaping an imaginary world that we are able to subjectively enter. Just as we have argued about the primary role of prior knowledge in comprehending texts in other disciplines, prior knowledge plays an equally important role in comprehending literary texts. The sources of prior knowledge that readers need to include but are not limited to the following. Text structures going beyond the school-based genres, defined broadly as the short story, the novel, poetry, and drama. Students should know how to recognize irony and the use of unreliable narration. They should also be able to recognize genres such as magical realism, science fiction, allegory, fable, myth, and mystery. Specialized genres of poetry include haiku, sonnet, ballad, and epic. Phototypical human practices and internal states, and the kinds of goal-directed behaviors that such internal states often trigger, i.e., for example, how jealousy and insecurity can lead to violence. A range of interpretive problems embedded in rhetorical tools employed by authors, including symbolism, irony, satire, and problems of points of view, including unreliable narration. Readers need not only to include that they can expect to meet such interpretive problems, but should be able to recognize the rhetorical signs of their use in text, and to draw on a variety of sources of information, depending on the interpretive problem, to reconstruct what is typically a figurative message. And the ability to make intertextual links drawing on the reader's knowledge about the author, other authors, related texts in which a given work of literature is in convention. For example, many literary works make allusions to the Bible or other texts within the same genre. For example, the use of magical realism by authors and diverse such as Toni Morrison, Gabriel Marquez, Francis Kafka, and Amos Tutula. Character types, for example, seeing Hamlet and the unnamed narrator of Ralph Ellison's classic Invisible Man as both exemplars of the tragic hero or its modern counterpart, the anti-hero. The archetypical themes, not only from the literary but also other traditions as well. One of the challenges to the literary curriculum at both middle and high school levels is how to help students, especially struggling readers, develop conceptual understanding of all these knowledge sources and help them learn to appreciate and develop a disposition to read complex literary works across the lifespan. Literary works that capture human experience and dilemmas from time periods from the historical past can pose particular difficulties for contemporary novice readers. The language of Shakespeare is difficult not only because of its poetry, but also because of its syntax. The use of pronouns and vocabulary do not map to contemporary uses of languages as illustrated in the soliloquy from Romeo and Juliet. Words that are not part of the contemporary English in this export include yonder, thou, and vestal livery. The syntax of the opening sentence, what light through yonder window breaks, is an inverted form. A more conventional and contemporary syntax would read, what light breaks through the window over there. There are also literary debates about mythical allusions to the moon, such as Diana, goddess of the moon, and patron of virgins in Roman mythology. Go ahead, Crystal.
The social settings of older texts are often far removed from the life experiences and social values that young people understand. In The Necklace by French writer Guy de Maupassant, younger readers will not automatically understand the rigid class structures of Paris in the 1880s and therefore not appreciate how the desire for upward mobility is so strong as to distort the value system of Mademoiselle Loisel. Novice readers of the Greek tragedies often find the literal plots ridiculous. However, we do know that experienced readers can subjectively enter imaginary worlds that are far removed from their own lived experiences. They need tools to understand such worlds, to be able to map salient features of these unfamiliar environments to their own prototypical dilemmas as human beings. Greek tragedies often involved a tragic hero who suffers because of hubris or exaggerated self-pride and who engages in an act that reflects a fatal flaw of character. While the exact actions and setting of Oedipus the King by Sophocles may not resonate with the average 11th or 12th grade high school student, whether he or she lives in a low-income urban community or a more affluent suburb, many of these same students can predict what will happen when Erica Kane tells a lie in a scene from the soap opera All My Children. Ironically, in viewing films, our students are pretty good at what Samuel Taylor Calderbridge calls a suspension of disbelief necessary to enter imaginary worlds of fiction. Most filmgoers know they have and will likely never experience what they see in the Star Wars films, but they are able to map the adventures and challenges of a Luke Skywalker onto the kinds of adventures they can imagine and perhaps even experience. Our students even intuitively understand Luke Skywalker's story as a coming-of-age story and understand Anakin Skywalker, known also as Darth Vader, to be a kind of tragic hero even though they do not have the language to describe him as such. They respond to his suffering as a potential source of salvation. They understand he will learn some important lessons from his suffering as he fights for right finally at the end of his life. Darth Vader's complex attraction to the so-called dark side represents a tragic, fatal flaw. We make these assertions not simply to describe some of the kinds of prior knowledge that good readers need to interrogate rich literature, but also to make the case that students from many different backgrounds typically have life experiences that, when activated, can serve them quite productively in interpreting narratives. Overall, reading deeply complex literary text offers unique opportunities for students to wrestle with some of the core ethical dilemmas that we face as human beings. Learning to understand sources of threat and to adapt to a challenging and difficult environment are major challenges that we have as humans across the life course. We learn lessons about such grappling from many sources, our families, friends, church, and other social networks. But we can also learn from reading literature, how to understand what makes a Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, engage in an act of murder under the ostensible self-explanation of accomplishing good, may provide insights into how ordinary human beings often align themselves with evil. Human enslavement of Africans in the United States remains a kind of Damocles sword over the consciousness of Americans that has never been fully resolved. What that experience meant in human terms is perhaps best captured in the characters of Sadie and Poldy and Toni Morrison's beloved A Story of Broken Human Resilience in the Face of Unbelievable Adversity.
The point of these examples is to illustrate the quality of ethical reasoning that Greek literature invites. The growth of empathic ethical reasoning is one of the most important reasons for schools to serve as unique sites for the development of capacities and dispositions to read complex works of literature. Students who enter high school as struggling readers are quite capable of engaging with such texts, in part because these same students are often wrestling with complex challenges in their own lives. Such students typically have a history of academic underachievement, which poses complex psychological challenges. One of their most important developmental tasks is to learn to be resilient in the face of adversity. Reading in mathematics. Of all the academic disciplines taught in middle school and high school, the one we least expect to entail reading extend text is in mathematics. We expect students to face reading comprehension challenges and understanding word problems, for example, and to face some difficulties in understanding the text in graphic illustrations in mathematics textbooks. But mathematics text present special literacy problems and challenges for young readers. The standards of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics refer to mathematics as a language and a form of communication. These standards suggest using fictional literature that embodies mathematical ideas in the elementary school grades to help children make initial connections between mathematics and the real world. However, what such linkages might mean at the secondary school level remains unexplored. Most decisions on reading in mathematics in school have focused on textbooks. Typically, studies have attempted to make explicit the structure of mathematics textbooks. Students are taught to identify the functions of prototypical sections of mathematics textbooks, general statements, use of bold print, definitions, examples, explanations, summaries, margin notes, diagrams, in order to know what kind of information they are reading to understand. Also, many studies employ generic reading strategies supporting students in previewing, making predictions, rereading, and summarizing. These strategies are useful for tackling mathematics textbooks, but do not necessarily help students to develop conceptual understanding, which comes only through mathematical modeling and repeated practice with problem solving. There is no question that mathematics textbooks can serve as a significant barrier for students who are struggling readers. It is also true that students can learn mathematics procedures and concepts in the absence of understanding their textbooks, depending on how instruction is organized. Some textbook series explicitly emphasize reading. For example, the University of Chicago School Mathematics Project organizes lessons to require independent reading in mathematics. On the website of their commercial publisher, UCMP offers the following explanation. Why is reading so important? Studies have shown that students in general do not read traditional mathematics books. As a result, these students do not learn to become independent readers capable of acquiring mathematics outside of school when their need arises. UCSMP addresses these problems by making reading a regular part of each lesson and including questions over the reading. Here are some reasons for reading that teachers can give to students.
Cassie, what's the point of us reading this? What? It's like, what's the point of us reading it?
Okay.
I don't know.
So why don't we discuss that in partners, and then
Okay.
we'll get back to that.
Mm-hmm.
You can talk.
I honestly have no idea.
I was gonna have a whole class discussion.
I know.
It's just basically reading is
It's
important for all
basic
content,
Yeah.
which we've learned in our
I
last
don't
walk.
understand. I
That's my
I
question,
kind of
so.
get it, but I think this is too long. They should just stick to science and math because it
Yeah.
applies to us. I don't care about social studies. I don't care about history. You know,
That's
what I'm interested is in science and math. So what they say about science and math, you just read about math that kids have problems reading math textbooks because for me it tells me because they have no practice. Because we took away the textbooks.
But I feel
And
like
then-
that's the pattern in all of it, though.
I know,
Like
yeah.
for all of the curriculum or all of the content.
And I don't
is-
know why. Because why? Why did they take away textbooks? You know.
You don't see a connection between math and science and social studies or anything like that?
No.
I mean, I think the connection is just they don't have enough practice, if that's what they're talking about. But I mean, because there is, historical. We'll read about. You can do a science experiment on maybe a volcano that happened a long time ago, and you can read on the history of it, all that stuff, and you can use. Is it like historian databases?
Yeah.
Things like that to find stuff on something that's already happened in science, like a supernova. If we know that one's coming, we can study the history on one. But that's the only.
Mhm. Yeah, I think connecting math and science is also like really important to connect to the real world, like that volcano example. I remember in one of my Radiant seminars, they talked about a project-based learning where they put a biology classroom and a history classroom together, and they basically talked about like the historical significance of a certain disease that happened in history, like what happened, what could have been done to prevent that, and what's the science behind it.
See, to me, that's not history. That's more like reading science in the past. You know, like a science kind of description.
Yeah.
Pure history to me is what happened in this war. Or, what happened with the Declaration of Independence. That to me, that's history. Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, history and science can go pretty well together. I don't believe in siloing different subjects together. Also, back in the reading, it said for elementary schoolers or something like that. Let's see. It's a very long article.
There's 18 pages.
It's
Yeah.
too long to.
But I do believe in science and math and ELA because you can always improve reading and writing.
Oh yeah.
Even if if it's in ELA, you can just kind of match it and make sure they talk, they write, they give different representations.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I'm not really into history. You can tell.
I
This is my real name.
I like history. I don't like studying history.
I just feel like this is so long about stuff that I just kind of don't care about.
Yeah, that's understandable. But I mean, I didn't assign this. Dr. West did. So we should finish it. We should.
Inclusion is literally like one paragraph out of like 20 pages. It's just one little paragraph.
I think to me
Oh,
it's just
okay.
repeating itself and repeating
Yeah.
itself and repeating itself so far because it's basically just saying that reading needs to take practice and everybody's got to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important for all subjects. That's really what this whole article.
But does it even offer like a solution to the problems that it describes?
Generally, no. Not in these kind of
It just points out issues and issues and issues, but there is no suggestions. I don't know.
Maybe we'll get to it. We'll see. Okay, sorry. We can start back up.
It's okay.
I'm gonna need
I
a walk
understand.
After this, it's taken us almost an hour to read this article.
Yeah, I understand. It's very frustrating.
It's very
but- It's very frustrating.
Your turn on the future.
Okay. You must read to succeed in future courses that use mathematics and in